Repetition. My name is Ben Hanse, Head of Research and Innovation with the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, largest global alliance for city climate leadership, now counting more than 12,500 cities and representing more than 1 billion people worldwide, and with a significant amount of potential to reduce emissions, to build adaptive capacity, and most recently, following the launch yesterday, now allowing cities and local governments to take action, report on energy access and energy poverty, whichever one or ones of those might be most relevant. One of the first things I'd love to start with in this session, and again, you might have seen from the title, we are looking at two key conferences around research and innovation coming into 2023. One of those is the Innovate for Cities conference, and the other is the annual Innovation Summit, which we'll hear more about from Georgia later on in the second panel. But let's start with the Innovate for Cities conference. This, the first one was held last year in October, and from that we were able to garner significant insights. First, we were able to launch an updated global research and action agenda. Some of you might have seen that wheel earlier. It'll come back here in a second. And then also produce an updated city research and innovation agenda. Those now form the evidence base collectively for global covenant work around research and innovation, around data, and other pieces. One of the great things about this conference is it now feeds directly into the 7th assessment report cycle of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So all of the fantastic inputs that we heard from 7,000 participants virtually, 159 countries represented, and attending more than 220 sessions are feeding into that and making sure that we can contribute the evidence base to a much broader community of practice, of practitioners, academics, and other sectors of society as well. One of the great things to also come out of this conference, which I should obviously say co-hosted together with our good friends at UN Habitat, Bernard here in the room, and we'll hear from him in a bit. Last year's edition being co-sponsored as well by the IPCC. One of the pieces was an updated set of priority gaps that cities themselves have told us they are facing on the ground, right? And again, apologies if you've heard this before, the inner ring looking at cross-cutting issues. No one particular thematic area that they belong to, but they literally cut across all of the challenges that cities are facing on the ground, whether that's governance, justice, equity, health systems approach, and among others. The middle ring is really containing a lot more of those topical areas that I was just mentioning, so finance, urban planning and design, uncertainty, and the latest one that was added from last year's conference, history and cultural heritage, which is an incredibly important piece, and we just heard about that in 2 sessions ago in this space earlier today. And then the outer ring are sort of the enablers, partnerships, co-production of knowledge, and being able to empower cities to take action, all of which are being delivered by different partners across and beyond the Global Covenant Alliance as well. One of the other key pieces that we wanted to make sure from last year's Innovate for Cities conference back in October, regional perspectives. Global Covenant Secretariat is based in Brussels, oftentimes called out for being a bit of an ivory tower. We're very aware of that, and we want to make sure that we continue to go back into regions and elevate a lot of the feedback that we get to hear from them, but also that they get to be part of that process, not just to use them as a sounding board, but then to also co-create the solutions and the partnerships together with them. And this is a core element now of Innovate for Cities, is to be able to go to each of the regions you see on the slide and say, who are the ones who can provide solutions, who are the ones who can provide funding, and let's get you hooked up and connected with the cities on the ground, the other partners on the ground who need some of those solutions, those resources to get action implemented. Lovely. We had an amazing team of graphic designers very quickly sketching together all of the different ideas, the key takeaways. Some familiar faces on here. Deborah Roberts, you'll hear from her in a few minutes as well on the second panel. Just highlighting the diversity, but also the interconnectedness of all of the topics that we're facing as part of the Innovate for Cities journey. I mentioned earlier the City Research and Innovation Agenda, and it's worth a bit of a deep dive here as core work that's coming out of Innovate for Cities, yes, but also the Research and Innovation Technical Working Group under the Global Covenant, which is now focused on following the city journey. And you see that here on the bottom of the slide. You can head on over to globalcovenantofmayors.org to take a closer look at what that journey entails. But it's essentially understanding that each city, no matter what size, no matter what background, no matter what socioeconomic factors you could use to define or characterize that city, can be at any stage of this journey, whether that's an assessment, creating a greenhouse emissions inventory, developing their strategies, their climate action plans, right? CAPs, SIA CAPs, whatever you might call them in your region, or monitoring and reporting and maybe even evaluating what's happening now in those cities. And this agenda is designed to fit into any one of those phases, any one and all of those phases, I should say, and make sure that we can support cities in that voice that they're sharing, that they can bring solutions forward faster and further than their national government counterparts. One of the ways we're doing that through the agenda is, of course, through a process, a city-based process. We spoke to cities directly about what the most useful questions might be to elevate Innovate for cities or to elevate research and innovation priorities. And they're really simple. This is probably not strange to anyone in this room. How do you build the evidence base? Where does the data come from? How and for whom should we be prioritizing? So an equity question as well of making sure that communities who are underrepresented or marginalized are part of this, or vulnerable communities as well are part of this solution. The actions that we actually need to take, what do we do as a city? And then as I was saying earlier, the X billion-dollar question is how do you finance and scale all of that action, not just within your own district, not even just within your own country, but beyond countries, going into regions and making sure that so many people can benefit from the solutions that are on tap. This reflects a lot of what I mentioned earlier on the regional piece. This is ongoing work for us at technical working group level to understand which priorities are most relevant to each region. The text is pretty small, so I do apologize for that. Again, this report is also available on the Global Covenant website, but it's preliminary work, very hard work done together with the University of Melbourne, Dr. Kathy Oak and team, focused on where different research and innovation priorities rank, or at least are most frequently cited and heard of within different regions of the world. And this is, again, some of the work that we want to build on and elevate going forward. And then we come to the call to action, which kind of puts us in a neat segue just before we open it up to our first panel, where we want to continue to partner with national governments. We need to connect with the private sector. We need to continue to catalyze academic engagement as well, these bastions of research and of innovation in different parts of the world, to then raise up cities and keep them involved in the process no matter what, all of whom together can move faster and meet and maybe even exceed, in an ideal world, the goals of the Paris Agreement, and of course now working with the GCoM Alliance of Cities. Now, I'm going to steal a little bit of Georgia's thunder. Georgia is the director of the Urban Transitions Mission, and I just want to provide a teaser. We'll come to her in a second on the second panel. But if you were here for the last session, you'll have heard of this a little bit too. Earlier this week, on Monday, Urban Transitions Mission Georgia announced the launch of the first cohort of cities who will be part of the Urban Transitions Mission. And if you have not heard of this before, this is one of the second wave of missions under what's termed the Global Mission Innovation, an initiative of 24 countries, including the European Commission now, focused on a clean energy transition, and of course also on bringing the out in research and innovation to elevate that work and make it go further and faster. The aim, of course, is to help these cities and prop them up, build capacity to take this action, get them on a framework towards taking action on climate and on energy. And the aim is that by 2030, these then pathways, this framework, can be validated by a much larger group of cities as well, and continue to scale that on. This is a pretty thick slide, but I'll just go through it very quickly. Want to make sure that the framework is designed with global perspectives, but also using what we are hearing from our regions and specific cities and countries. We want to be able to build out a platform for knowledge exchange, right? A lot of cities are telling us that they learn best from each other, and we're here to help facilitate a lot of that work. We want to help identify needs-based solutions. So in the context of the place that we're in now, the Global Innovation Hub, and the approach that they're taking around the needs-based framework, make sure that we integrate that. And then, of course, the fun part, or all of this is fun, but 4 is particularly fun, being able to use cities as test beds, as Andy was saying previously, and make sure that we can test, pilot, and scale up solutions as well. And tied to our questions around multi-level governance, we need to bring in national governments, some of whom may be sitting in the room, and if you're here, welcome. But we're here to make sure that we get to have not only the conversation, but structured implementation pathways to make sure that we're supporting cities in the best way possible, because we know that they can implement those solutions. And if we secure jobs, prosperity, if we secure the opportunity in cities, that also means we are working to secure that at a national level. So, I'll pause there, and I know we're a bit short on time, so without further ado, let me call on two wonderful folks who are here in the room with us today. First of all, Lord Mayor of Hobart, Australia, Anna Reynolds, if you'd like to take a seat up here just on the panel, and I'll join you there. And then I do have to apologize, Mayor Cinthia Ribeiro is unfortunately unable to join us today. She's feeling a little ill, but who I do have is someone who's just as fantastic, might I say, a good friend of the Global Covenant also. Braulio Diaz of ICLEI South America. He's regional manager for institutional relations and advocacy. Braulio works with so many cities in the region. Please have a seat, and it's just really nice to join you. Thanks for joining. So I'm going to take a seat right here with you. It's nice to get a little cozy. And just want to ask a few questions to you and understand your experiences a little bit more. Some of this work around conferences, around the 2 initiatives. For your context specifically, what are some of the research and innovation gaps that you are facing in your cities, and are there any that really stand out in your experience?
I'd like to, is that working? Yeah. I guess I'm going to try and bring 2 quite different perspectives to the room that from my perspective I think are worth talking about. The first is, and I mentioned it in the earlier panel, that local government is political, democracy is political, and what I sometimes worry about is that we talk about innovation and cities taking action, and we're not factoring in politics. We're not thinking about learning from failure, like which are the cities where they were ambitious on cycleways and, you know, and they got the backlash and the council was thrown out. I mean, you know, we can be very optimistic about innovation and all the good ideas in the world, but, you know, there are other forces that are fighting against climate action and are slow to see the benefits, and you can present all the evidence you like about the benefits of a city innovation and they'll still say, well, you know, that's not right and climate change doesn't exist, and you know, that's the world that I occupy, and it's, I'm not saying that that's, you know, that should dominate or that should drive, you know, good programs, but I think we need to be aware that many of our cities and the staff trying to do good things are getting all of this fantastic research, getting all of this fantastic support, but then they take it up to their decision makers, and they, you know, we haven't necessarily brought the politics or the community or the decision makers along with us. So I don't have the answer to that, but I think part of it is that all of these city programs have to engage directly with mayors and councillors, and, you know, and the research and the surveys have to somehow, and it's hard because mayors are busy, but, you know, it's no point just researching with officers at the technical level. You have to make sure that the research is reaching both the officers who, of course, have longevity in organisations and they are the subject experts, but unfortunately they're not running the city, and I wish sometimes they possibly were running the city, but it's really important that these mission innovations and research projects are learning from the political side of government. So that's my first suggestion, I guess. The other one is just around, I guess, the big picture here this week. Hearing a lot of, I think the message that I've heard very loud and clear is that the city's movement, the city's community at the international level are trying to get better recognised and trying to be heard and recognised by national governments and the international treaty. I'd really like somebody to benchmark how much multilateral money has actually come to cities. Because unless we know that our baseline, we can't advocate for a doubling or a tripling or whatever it is. And ultimately, I don't think we're going to really get the uplift we want until we, get this kind of agenda recognised in the same way loss and damage or adaptation or resilience building has really sort of made it up into the multilateral agreements with a very tangible sort of directive or mechanism. I mean, we don't have a cities mechanism or a multi-action mechanism. Maybe we need to be thinking that over the next 2 or 3 years, that's what we're working towards, and we have to actually understand, though, how much, I don't know how much money has made it out of the various multilateral things that have been around, things like the Green Carbon Fund or the Green Climate Fund. Do we know how much of it has made its way to city programs? I don't know, but wouldn't it be nice to have a piece of work to understand, to map all that and see where we are now, and then how do we then advocate for a doubling or a tripling from that point? So that's just an observation from this week, but something that I think would be good to put on the table.
Lord Mayor Reynolds, thank you for that. Just one thing to compliment, and just building off of that last point, it's really interesting. We have great partners over at the City Climate Finance Leadership Alliance who are doing some of this work, right? And what's really interesting is you're absolutely right. There's a dearth of understanding around this data. Their latest report from last year in 2021 could only pick up data on project level from 2017 to 2018, which is a little dated for standards today about being able to get data where we need it. But within that data, some of the initial findings found that of the climate finance that's going to cities today, only somewhere between 7 to 10% of that is going to adaptation. In the context of this COP and in the context of places literally burning to the ground or being flooded, inundated, it's absolutely not enough. And just as it is not enough that we don't have that more data to be able to work with and have up on these slides here, be able to engage in a more meaningful conversation. So really appreciate that call to action that you've just sort of put out there. And we'll try to get working on that and cracking on that much more in the near future. Braulio, I still had the same question for you, just very curious to hear research and innovation priorities, topics that are most relevant to cities in South America, Latin America.
Let me see if it works. No. Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you also, Lord Mayor. Well, first of all, excuses on behalf of the Mayor of Palmas that she's not really feeling that well, so she needed to go back to her hotel. But, well, I'm Braulio Diaz. I work for ICLEI Network, a global network of more than 1,000 local governments, local and regional governments, and in South America. I guess this is one of the questions that we are working along or trying to figure out to develop some of our projects and portfolio to offer to the cities. How come we can create a more organic and synergic relationship between data use, data taxonomies, and how to develop that at local level, with what Lord Mayor was mentioning, the political vision, everything normally, well, this is a real political agenda that could be enhanced if we contribute with content, with this content of data to the politics, to the policy designing and also the policy decision making. And you presented the prioritized thematics. I guess they haven't changed that much from the last year to this year, but I would recall on 3 that we are working along in ICLEI South America together with our members. The first one is in terms of governance. And I guess this is one of the key issues for all, or one of the key challenges for more for smaller and medium-sized cities. Governance in terms of how do we continue to include innovations, not just technological innovations, but how do we manage to co-create data and specific approaches to the territorial problems with a multi-stakeholder approach. In local communities, how do we engage the civil society, the enterprise or the private sector, and the academia or the local schools into creating some specific data. I see in one of these days a mapping that they did in a favela in Sao Paulo. They create, together with the local community, they indicated where those the violence spots were in a neighborhood. Where does the public services weren't working? You know, this kind of initiatives, and if we manage to identify them and systematize them and then enhance and put in the work of other cities, perhaps this is also a solution in this complexity of the governance. And this, of course, with the multi-stakeholder engagement, also the multi-level perspective, since we know there is a lack of discussion, and this we see it with the NDCs. I mean, all the campaigns, they are advocating, same with in the frame of GCoM, but also Race to Resilience, Race to Zero, trying to create a collective narrative, or even the agendas, the Agenda 2030, this framework that gives us the route to create a collective narrative. I think this is the way, but as I was saying, how to create this engagement, this local engagement, one of the most important issues. The second one, that also is part of the ones that you were mentioning, Ben, is how do we ensure a scope of integrated urban planning? So how do we pass from to really mention or to really sorry, I forgot the word, but to really identify how does the climate agenda and the urban agenda are one. So they are not communicated. We need to, well, they are not always communicating, and I'm focusing in the small and medium-sized cities. We need to create these channels of communication. This is something that it's very, very important, and we see a lot of examples in South America in this regard. Some good examples, for instance, I'm thinking on city of Cuenca with all the new urban design regarding mobility, and it's amazing. But I also would think in the Amazonic cities that they are really in the lack of all these mechanisms. And the last one, perhaps, and that is, and I mean, just one input else, one other input in the integrated urban planning, always having in mind 3 concepts: justice, and how to ensure, or how to focus also in poverty reduction with the climate agenda, okay? And the final, sorry for that, is the gap between the construction or the technical project design for these for these cities in regard of how does the financial institutions are now seeing this, how to identify, how to put money in projects that are bankable. We're working a lot on that in ICLEI, and to develop more interesting projects for the to create this link between financial institutions and local projects that have that have a long-term impact. Sorry if I...
Braulio, no need to apologize. Yo sé que inglés no es tu primer idioma y tengo que agradecerte por esa conversación. And we need to make sure that we have these kinds of conversations in other languages in different regions as well, really to make sure that we can, again, elevate those perspectives and keep them engaged. We just moved to our second panel, but my last question to you, Lord Mayor Reynolds, this is very rude of me, actually. I should have congratulated you. You were just recently reelected, so congratulations on that. Indeed. Round of applause, please. But one of the questions that's been on my mind for a long time in this field is the concept of taking risk, right? When we talk about research and innovation, we talk about innovation in the famed valley of death, right? Things where ideas and projects go and never come back out oftentimes. Cities are public entities, and there's a very strong threshold or high threshold for accountability you face as a mayor. To get a city or a city like yours to take those risks, take approaches, new ideas and initiatives, what do you need to feel comfortable enough to take that partners across different sectors?
What sort of risk are you thinking of? Yeah, I think all decision makers will approach things differently, and we do need to ensure that we're getting good people going into politics, and we're getting diversity in our councils. I know some countries have more diversity in their local governments, have women and people from different cultural backgrounds, and I think any board, I think a more diverse council, a more mix of people will deliver probably a different approach to risk and maybe more appetite for risk. If you're all the same sort of people, you'll probably have the same view about risk. So I think diversity of political representation is fundamental. The media is a real challenge. It's the media and the social media environment. It can be quite if a media outlet decides it's a really silly idea, and there's a couple of political opponents sort of determined to drag something down, it is very easy to drag down an innovative idea. So there's a lot stacked against innovation, and it is about how it's sold, the communication. So if it's there is a sense, I think you have to make sure all of your ducks are in a row, and you've got your supporters, you anticipate the opponents, you think about how you're going to sort of neutralise that argument that's going to maybe push against something, and yeah, I think it is something cities do need to think about. And there are offices in many cities around the world, I'm sure, that have put up an innovative idea and they've worked on it for a year and worked with colleagues and done the research and got the data, and then they've sort of taken it up to a political meeting, and it's been sort of ignored or argued against, and it's failed, and it's very disheartening for those officers. So I think it's important that innovative ideas need to have that kind of a team to work through both the sort of the technical, the legal risks, but also the PR risks and the communications risks, so that it's got the best chance of success, and the political risks obviously as well. So yeah, having a team of people that are working together rather than just a couple of very enthusiastic practitioners. I would suggest that CEOs of councils need to ensure that the innovators inside an organisation have the support of leadership, political leadership, but also communications and other support, so that it's got the best chance of success.
Lord Mayor Reynolds, thank you so much for that. I think communication is something that we haven't talked about enough, actually, within council, but also from leaders to their communities, and how you make something last as long as possible, especially when it's disruptive in the sense that innovations can be. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there. Look, I don't think folks recognize how far Australia, let alone Tasmania, is from here. So really want to thank you for your time. Braulio, thank you for your time as well. Let's give these two a round of applause, please. Thank you so much. If I can invite you to take your seats back in the audience, and I can invite up our next panel, names of whom you see behind me. Sheila, Georgia, Deborah, Bernard, Andy will be back in a few minutes. But if you could just all take a seat next to me here on my right, it would be amazing to jump right into this next conversation with you. And it's a wonderful segue following on from Lord Mayor Reynolds and from Braulio and the perspectives that we just heard there. So, second expert panel discussion around the two conferences that we've been discussing, or initiatives, Innovate for Cities, and then of course the Urban Transitions Mission and its annual Innovation Summit. Sheila, I'm going to start with you. Sheila Patel, ladies and gentlemen, founder, director of the Society for Promotion of Area Resource Centers, or SPARC, and of course a group co-chair of the Innovate for Cities advisory group from last year's conference. Last year we saw this focus on informality, a concept that you know a lot about, and that's talking about both the sector and settlements. Going into next year, which is not very far away, where do you see some of the greatest impact in tackling the climate challenge and the climate crisis through the lens and the communities within informality?
So yeah, I think this works, yeah. I just want to start with how depressed I am about how little is spoken about informality in general. Shall I start again? Make it closer to you now. Okay, yeah. Okay. No, so I want to start off by saying how depressed and concerned I am that the general discussion about cities as the space in which more than 10 years ago the world became urbanized. We're still not recognizing that, and we're also not recognizing the reality that over 1 billion people, if you have a very conservative estimate, live informally for 4 generations already in the cities, and their innovation is at subsistence level. So what are we talking about? That's my first thing. The second thing is that in this in the climate change space, cities are just seen as carbon emitters, huge consumption, bad guys. But the fact that there is an anticipated 1.5 billion people who are going to come as climate refugees to cities in the next 10 years is something that seems to be outside even the periphery of our discussion. So I'm very concerned that in the climate space, everything rural is virtuous and everything urban is bad. So innovation will have to be, will often be maladaptation because there's not enough research, there's not enough investments, there's not enough legitimacy, and there is certainly very little governance to do with what is happening in cities. So I want to stop there to say, before we go into fabulous, innovative possibilities, you start with fundamentals. We're talking about loss and damage here. Do you know the loss and damage that poor people who get evicted face time and time again? We don't calculate it, we don't acknowledge it, and we do not accept any responsibility for the fact that we continue these colonial planning institutional arrangements that make everybody who lives in informal settlements illegal. So I want to start from there and then say, what are the innovations we need to do to change planning, to make everybody who lives informally a legal citizen. I want to know what we need to do in planning standards that allow people to get investments, infrastructure to come to them. And what are we going to do to acknowledge that all of us who live in the cities in the global south are living comfortably on the backs of poor people whose informal livelihoods are, they subsidize so we can live a good life. So I want to start from there. Innovations will come later, sorry.
I love the light start that we've made to this panel. No, that's a rousing wake-up call, Sheila, and a good segue actually to the next panel. Deborah, I want to turn to you. Given in the context of this call, and I know from last year, I still remember very vividly, right, when we were on this panel together as well, in the closing plenary of Innovate for Cities 2021, you were mentioning that we're in a race to zero on emissions, a race to resilience, right, and many others as well. A year on, or more than a year on, and well into our run, we've got the Global Research and Action Agenda, the City Research and Innovation Agenda, Summary for Urban Policymakers, volumes 1 to 4 now out there in the world. What capacities, what injections, what inspirations do we need now to really keep our pace up, or actually I should say, accelerate our pace even further, especially in the context of the lack that Sheila just mentioned?
Thanks, Ben. Can people hear me? Yeah, even I can hear me. I think the world has got a great deal more complex since our discussions last year. So I want to pick up on Sheila really bringing that messy, complex, suboptimal world forward. You know, when we talk about innovation, somehow it's cold and clinical and decisive, and the world is getting increasingly far away from that. So in the last session last year in Innovate for Cities, I spoke about a race to zero, a race to resilience, but it's very clear from the IPCC report we released in February this year that that's simply no longer good enough. We can't have two disjunct races. In fact, we need to have a relay race between those two things, because what the science is very clearly pointing to is that even with the best intentions, our attempts at bold mitigation are creating problems in undermining adaptive capacity. So, you know, Sheila speaks to conditions that we don't acknowledge in the informal sector, but if we get heavily invested in mitigation activities that, for example, undermine land tenure rights for women, we undermine adaptive capacity. But we're also seeing the same thing in our attempts to create resilience and adaptation movement. We're seeing potential for maladaptation that creates further greenhouse gases. And so what we've got now is a world that's much more complex. Two separate races no longer works. We need to be running both races at the same time, but at the same time as we're running that relay race, trying to pass the baton between those two priorities, we need to be playing a football game. Because of the fact that we've also highlighted it's not good enough to do adaptation and mitigation together. We have to do that in the context of sustainable development for precisely the reasons that Sheila indicated, that none of this means anything without equity and justice being in the mix. So everything has to be done through those lenses of equity and justice. So that's a very complex thing. I almost wish we were at the end of Innovate for Cities last year, because the world was much cleaner and clinical in those days, it would seem. So what does that actually mean? I think there's a new pressure and expectation then on those of us who work with that messy world, with the complexity that Sheila spoke about, is to think of closing the loop. And I spoke to this morning. We talk about going from science to action. I think this messy world needs from action to science. We've got to draw some of this messiness, this complexity that we're actually all experiencing in our attempts to manage, plan, and direct cities, and allow that to begin to influence the science, because the science is influential. The reports from the IPCC are influential. The Summary for Urban Policymakers will be influential. But that science remains in a hermetically sealed bubble unless we start bringing some of the suboptimal complexity in. And we can only do that by bringing these experiences back to that science. And that for me is the big challenge for the third piece. We started off with a cities and climate change conference in Edmonton, was very be science focused. You know, what does science have to tell us about how we manage the cities? Last year we more balanced the conversation to open up a dialogue between practice and science. I think the third episode of this conference must focus on getting that action recorded. What are our actual experiences on the ground, those billions of people, the day-to-day occurrences, to get that in, to use that platform, to draw it into the literature that can feed into the science to allow us to advise that. So I'm with Sheila, I'm worried. I think we're heading for a suboptimal world. We don't have the toolkit. No one is brave enough to start talking about the fact that we need a new toolkit for a suboptimal world, and I think that's the challenge for the third installment. Thanks, Ben.
Deborah, thank you. Very poignant as always. Deborah Roberts, folks, IPCC AR6 Working Group 2 co-chair, Innovate for Cities Advisory Group co-chair as well, and in her spare time is still lifting up the lives of all of her folks back in Durban in South Africa. I don't know how you do it. It's a mystery to me. Thank you. Bernard, I'll turn to you. You've been very patient as well, sort of waiting there, and in fact, it's very timely. Earlier, I'll say earlier, I think the session is concurrent. In the One UN Pavilion, we heard about the need to sort of strengthen multi-level governance. Yesterday, we also saw the launch of the Multi-Level Climate Action Playbook in the LGMA Pavilion. Governance is a clear cross-cutting priority in both of the agendas that we have here. How do you see that being leveraged as an opportunity for climate action implementation in cities and local governments?
Thanks, Ben, and actually a very exciting topic, the way you have framed this. UN Habitat and GCoM work together in a way on two pillars, the innovation and the multi-level climate action dimensions, and of course they are connected, as you've also framed. In the session that we've just had, it was just preceding this one, we looked at different dimensions of multi-level action. There is the need for a stronger integration of the urban dimension into NDCs. We've talked about the analysis there. What are the gaps? What's missing? What needs to be put forward? We've talked about urban law and the tools that are needed. But ultimately, our engagement on multi-level climate action from a cities agency is cities can't do it alone, communities can't do it alone, therefore the national government connection needs to be more strongly brought into supporting cities. But ultimately it's also not about national and city and maybe community. It really goes down to also what you're saying, Sheila. It goes down to the household, individuals, and bringing all of this together. And interestingly, I think
they love you, Bernard. You're incredible, man.
I know, but there's not all that much to cheer about, as we've heard, so we should enjoy that for a moment as well. So I think from none of us, you hear the technology and what needs to be done to cut X amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the context of innovation. But it's about what processes, what partnerships need to be put in place to make a difference. At the community level, in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and everything in between. So yes, as you say, innovation is a cross-cutting theme in terms of the Innovate for Cities agenda, but it's also a cross-cutting theme that we are taking into the first urban ministerial meeting that's going to happen tomorrow, which hopefully can really make a difference in terms of accelerating urban climate action and ultimately having the impacts that we are looking for. Of course, at that ministerial meeting, the COP presidency is going to launch an urban initiative, and again, innovation is a cross-cutting dimension, is critical to be put into this. So at every level, innovation is being addressed, and as I said many times, to make a difference have impact for the people that need it most.
Bernard, that's very poignant as well, and very useful in the context of Innovate for Cities conference that we aim to hold again next year, focused a bit more on implementation. So Deborah was talking about bringing the action back to science and vice versa. There's an opportunity here to take a look, given the evidence base that we have and what we've been able to collect, assessing where we can actually take action with the right partners on the ground, not just at a global level, right? But also in region, in country, and make sure that we get the most relevant projects up off the ground and Bernard Barthooks, Climate Change and Urban Environment Coordinator at UN Habitat. Thanks so much for your inputs. I'll move to Georgia next. You've been patiently waiting the most here. In your capacity as Director for the Urban Transitions Mission, I guess Innovate for Cities in this context is a bit old. Not old per se, of course, but the annual Innovation Summit is a bit newer than that. I don't think many folks have heard about it, and it's a bit of a newcomer to the game. So would love for you to tell us a little bit more about what it is, what we might be able to expect, and the value that brings to the cities in the cohort.
Oh, thank you very much, Ben. And it's really much of a newcomer. It's actually never happened before, so it's something to really look forward to. But if you allow me, I would like maybe to take my answer about the Innovation Summit by building a bit of on a reaction that I want to share with you, Sheila. I think what you said makes absolute sense, and I think is something that the Urban Transitions Mission would like to also take note of while shaping what innovation means. And this is something that I would love to see also brought into the Innovation Summit per se. I think when we talk to about innovation very often, we still fall into the trap of thinking about innovation as technology only. And the the Urban Transition Mission that I have the pleasure to direct actually is looking into, yes, supporting cities into reaching their targets when it comes to become net zero as quickly as possible, but to do so via pathways that really propose an integrated approach across sectors, across partners, very important, but also really taking into consideration not only the dimension that relates to the technology, but also the social dimension and the regulatory dimension, because we need to have that basis. The other thing, and again, I think it's very much one of the ingredients that I would like to see into our Innovation Summit this year, is thinking about the solutions that we have there. Very often the solutions that we have there are also coming from the difficulties that the communities are facing. There are a lot of great ideas that are coming from small startups for communities that are facing specific challenges that must be innovative because they have no other choice to be anything else but innovative in facing the challenges that they have. So I'm hoping that it is a mission, of course, looking into decarbonizing, into bringing forward further resilience, but it also really wants to create a platform from cities from all over the world to share innovation of all types and to really learn this different dimension. So hopefully this is something that, to answer your question now, Ben, I'm sorry, but these are some of the ingredients that truly I would love to see in our Innovation Summit. Maybe you heard it, we launched our mission relatively recently, but the real news is that from Monday, we have the pleasure to work with a cohort of 48, soon to be 50, hopefully, cities that will be testing these pathways that we want to co-develop together with them to further this innovation. And we want to have a celebratory but also a working moment within our Innovation Summit, looking into how are we deploying the innovation on the ground, and in particular, how can we help these cities future-proofing the plans that they already have, the strategies that they already have, so that we can help them understand, did we prioritize right, or did we prioritize only what we could actually act on? And if we could act on anything, what will be the sector, the question that we should pose ourselves, and how can we help these cities in asking the question and bring forward solutions together with national government partners, but also with the business sector and of course with academia. So celebratory moment for the community, coming together, but also a space to talk about these solutions.
Thank you so much, Georgia. Great to hear. Obviously a big milestone indeed, but still so much more to be done as well. I do have to apologize on behalf of Andy. I think he was whisked away to another meeting that was unforeseen, but grateful to have his support, of course, co-managing director of the Global Covenant of Mayors Secretariat. We have time for one more question, and it's going to be a rapid fire one across all four. Just very curious to hear from you all. Innovate for Cities 2023 conference, which I don't think I've ever actually had roll off of my tongue ever, so there it is. We don't have a date yet, we don't have a location yet, but that's forthcoming, so stay tuned. Annual Innovation Summit coming next year as well. In 30 seconds or less from each of you, what one piece are you looking forward to the most, or what do you think is most urgent that needs to be tackled in a context of implementation at this COP, but then also meeting the needs that we've discussed here today? Sheila, let's start with you.
At this COP, we launched a campaign called Roof Over Our Heads. In every event that you have, between now and 2 years, there'll be 100 labs of community women exploring ways to transform their homes with new materials, new technology, and a measurement of the change that it makes in their lives. I want you to give them the same space you give me here in every single event. So I'm putting this stuff here. Deborah, this is for you.
Thank you.
And so I feel that we will be doing in these processes the innovation, or at least the demand for innovation that you're talking about. So next time I'll come with a laundry list.
From my end, I think one of the words that I've heard the most in this hub, but everywhere, it's really the word partnership. And this is something that we've been discussing for a number of years. And I feel now everyone is on the same page on the need to have this partnership running, but maybe we have not started to write yet on that page altogether. So maybe to also echo what Deborah already mentioned, it's time really to start acting on the things that we need to do and to really focus on delivering these solutions that we need. And again, an invitation to watch the space, connect with us on the Innovate for Cities conference, but also, of course, very much on the Innovation Summit, and watch out for what the Urban Transitions Mission is going to do. We look forward to working with all of you and to showcase, of course, the solution that we are co-creating.
I think the important thing for next year is a real reality check. At this COP, we've seen a strong focus on loss and damage, not only in theory, but we've lived a year full of losses and damages. There's still anxiety of adequate financing to support responses. We've seen real questioning about whether there are any credible pathways left to 1.5. I think it's critical we start developing the toolkit for a suboptimal future. That's the only responsible thing to do. We've got to have that on the agenda, and I think this is a critical moment to acknowledge that reality and find purpose and challenge.
In terms of innovation, we have a program starting that looks in much more detail at informality, not just informal settlements, which has been a priority for us, but how informality can be leveraged for climate action. But I think in terms of the big picture, back to the multi-level climate action, I hope that the ministerial meeting tomorrow really sets us on the right path, gets the city agenda, the local agenda, the community agenda much, much more strongly anchored in the global climate negotiations, and then, of course, in terms of implementation.
Thank you so much, everyone. Innovate for Cities 2023 and the Annual Innovation Summit. Again, more details to come, so please watch this space. If you think you want to get involved, please reach out to us. Send us a note, info@globalcovenantmayors.org. We'll be happy to reach back out to you. But for the time being, thank you, Sheila. For the time being, please, a round of applause for our esteemed panelists. Thank you so, so much. And that'll do it for our session today. Thanks so much, everybody.